Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Jarrell Mason. Welcome to another edition of Beyond the Album Cover, where we get inside the entertainment industry with those in the know and give them their flowers while they're here to be celebrated. We also interview people within the world of academia. And with me right now, I have a man who is assistant professor of media studies at the University of Texas at Austin, Hook'em Horns. His specialty is in critical media studies at the intersections of comedy, gender, Black pop culture. And if you've seen the Arsenio Hall episode on Vice's Dark Side of the 90s, then you will see his face and his eloquent voice talking so poetically about Arsenio Hall and its importance to pop culture. And ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big round of applause to Dr. Adrien Sebro to Beyond the Album Cover. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here. And I'm just looking forward to being in conversation with you, Terrell.
Yes, sir. I appreciate you taking the time. So let's just jump right into it. Where were you born?
Right.
And what was the journey like for you going into academia from undergraduate, graduate to finally getting that PhD?
Yeah, so I was born in a small town called Oceanside, California. It's in San Diego County, mainly a military town. It's next to Camp Pendleton. It's like the West Coast military base for the Marine Corps. My father was in the Marine Corps, and he ended up moving out west to work on the Camp Pendleton base, and we ended up, being based in Oceanside, California. From there on, long process, working through, leaving the military, working through, just working class livelihood, and oftentimes being poor, just like trying to always being taught to continue to work for what you have, and supporting family. So workers mentality and that hustle has always been a part of what I do. So undergraduate, I ended up working my way through high school with really good, pretty good grades, and I was able to get a scholarship to go to UCLA for undergraduate. And at UCLA, I studied gender studies and film and television, because I've always been interested in what media is saying about, particularly about Black men, but about Black people in general, right? So for me, it was important for me to get this education on, how gender plays out in America in every kind of field of in every endeavor, how gender works, how the kind of unconscious bias people have on gender, but also I was also interested in really how the media portrays that, and how the media is invested in kind of recycling images like that along with race, right? So with that, as undergrad, I was a member of a fraternity, Black fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, but I was also hugely involved with the African Student Union at UCLA. I was the co-chairperson there. So in that aspect, I kind of was always about how are Black people seen, how are they supported, and how do they build community? And in real life, through the advocacy work, but also through media. And from then on, after undergrad, I actually went on to my master's at Columbia in African American Studies. And there is kind of where I cultivated and realized that I want to continue going to academia, and really looking at how the media's role in kind of, recreating and rewriting the status of what Blackness looks like over time. And I've always been interested in that, particularly how Blackness looks in television, particularly in sitcoms, and how comedy has always been largely in control of white producers and white writers, even at the expense of Black actors. So with that I've always thought about how are we as Black people being, how is our images being recycled over time? What do our images say about us? Are we in control of said images, right? And also, no one image, represents all of Black people. So how are we able to, combine these different images and different identities to show this kind of status of Black culture being fluid, right? So from the master's, I ended up going back to UCLA for my PhD in film and television studies. So kind of these various different degrees, kind of combine them all together when I get back to for my PhD at UCLA. And really it was about learning the foundations of film, media, and TV history, and really how race has, been a particular, intervention in film and television history, and how film and TV history, reading it, watching it, and consuming it is really another way of determining and being able to express American history, right? So what is it about American history we get from watching and consuming film and TV? And so with that, I focused largely in my dissertation work on Black sitcoms, mainly of the 70s, ones that created and directed and produced by Norman Lear and like Tandem Productions. The same creator of, All in the Family created Sanford and Son, Good Times, and the Jeffersons, right? So with that knowledge and figuring these things out, like, it made me realize, okay, this white man had a complete control in this era they call the social relevance era, this complete control of what Black on TV looks like. So what does that mean? What's at stake for those actors, Black actors, writers, and producers who were a part of these shows, but they don't get the credit for them? So my dissertation work, and now what's actually going to be my first book, is particularly on, giving voice to the economics and the economics that were at stake with these Black actors and artists dealing with a white television industry that wasn't built for them. It's through a process called what I call hustle economics, this idea of how Black folks had to kind of hustle their way through an industry that wasn't built for them, hustle their way through life, to largely not even be acknowledged for the work they're doing, for being written off of shows, for having to, fight for rights on set that their white counterparts are kind of just naturally given, right? So since then, I have been graduated my PhD, and I've been at University of Texas at Austin since 2019 as an assistant professor here in film and television studies, or media studies in general. And yeah, I teach courses on film and social change, courses on about films that kind of promote, produce, or around social justice issues. I also teach largely a course on Black filmmakers. So pretty much kind of after the Blaxploitation era, how did Black filmmakers gain traction in Hollywood, and how are they able to kind of create different ideas of what Blackness looks like? A Black sitcom course that chronicles Black comedy from television's roots to presently, and also just courses on film and television history in general as well. And that's where I'm at now. And again, working on this first book. It's contracted to Rutgers University Press, and hopefully within, maybe fall 23, book will be in hand, and, I can revisit y'all here and talk about it in hand.
Yeah, I definitely will cop the book. And I'm curious to know, how long did it take for you to finish the PhD? Because I have a friend of mine, she completed a PhD in family and marriage counseling over at University of New Mexico. And the grind for a PhD, for those of you that really want to try to do it, I hear it's not for the weak.
No, it absolutely isn't. Mine took 5 years. And I think that's kind of, and also, like, a lot of life happens during a PhD, right? For myself, I didn't take any breaks between any of my degrees. Actually everyone but being one of my colleagues did. But yeah, I didn't take any breaks at all. So, I'm a younger professor because of that, but also I very tired as well too. So just being on the academic grind for so long straight. But for me, myself, it was 5 years, about 2 years, 2.5 years of actual in class coursework, and the rest of the time on framing, constructing, defending, and working on a dissertation, which is like, that larger document that's like, pretty much it is in a lot of ways what most people's first books are based off of the dissertation. So it's a large form document of original research that kind of determines your aptitude of knowledge within this field. It's largely kind of proving what you learned in this field, and then creating your own original research off of it. So yeah, myself, it was 5 years, and I've for most folks I know, anywhere from like 5 to 7 is kind of the norm. I do have some friends who finish in 4, but yeah, I think 5 is relatively fast, but it's like the norm.
Right, because
all depends on your field. Yeah.
Yeah, because me, when I went and got my master's degree in education, I had a 6-year gap between undergraduate and being enrolled in school, but the program was set up for full-time employees. So working during the day, doing
night
schooling at night
stuff.
classes, busting the hump, and it's not easy. So for those of you that really want to go into higher academic, be prepared mentally, physically, make sure your priorities are in order. And to me, it kind of feels like when you're doing your dissertation defense for your PhD, it kind of felt like that episode of Atlanta when they were testing the blackness, where you had the panel of three and they're just poking holes
Yeah.
and everything, wanting to make sure that you knew your stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. It's simply like, yeah, you're really in a room of people, you're in a room of people who are really just well, they have your work ahead of time, so they're coming with questions, but like how you present, a microcosm of your larger 200 or 200 plus page work, you're trying to present like a microcosm of that within an hour, right? And which you obviously can't talk about everything. You have to condense it to like one chapter, deeply talking about it, talk about your methods, talking about kind of what you gain from this, where you're like how you would take research how you would take this research further in the future. And then yeah, they're really kind of just grilling you mainly in like your in your stage where you went to like qualifying exams during your PhD. What you're doing before that is like taking the summer, or depending on what school program you're at, like a whole semester, and really you just like have a list of 20 or so books that you just like you read in order to like gain your complete knowledge of everything in the field. So pretty much myself, if my research focus is Black media, Black television, Black film, the reputable books in my field that cover that subject, I should have a knowledge of how they all tie within one another, and also how my research differs from all of those. So use all those to like apply it to like what I'm doing, but also use all those as springboard to kind of, okay, they all talk about this in this way. My research does this differently. So yeah, it really is them coming, just grilling your aptitude and knowledge from this particular research focus. And I'd be remiss if I said like it wasn't one of the hardest things I've ever been through, for sure. But yeah, it's definitely not for the weak. And I think a lot of folks, for myself, going to the master's made me realize I wanted to do it. But I have some friends who went to the PhD, realized that during it they didn't want to do it and they left. And I think that, and I'm proud of them for having the courage to do that, because it's hard to leave once you're in it, because it's very selective to get in the PhD. And you kind of feel like you have to do it once you're in there. But yeah, it's not for everybody. And those who realize that's not for them go on to other careers that they do. They probably would have suffered throughout the rest of the process, right? So realizing if it's for you or not, and there are a lot of ways to do that. Getting a master's, thinking about doing your own original research, or really kind of just talking to someone in the field that you are, possibly aspiring to be a part. That can like lead a lot of the your interests, and kind of figure out if that's the space for you or not.
Right. And you mentioned earlier that you did your undergraduate and PhD work at UCLA. Now, did the
Yes.
Black population over at USC and UCLA congregate a lot? And what was it like trying to get that HBCU feel at a PWI? And I had experience with that myself, going to a PWI undergraduate at University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And at my alma
Yeah.
mater, the only way you knew the Black folks were on campus when it was basketball season, because we didn't have a football team, and also when it was time for probate.
Right. And so the thing with, there are no like HBCUs on the West Coast. So I know at least in North Carolina, like, y'all have some across the state, and you probably go to, but like, yeah, for us, we would, there were times, undergrad, I traveled to Howard, I traveled to, Atlanta. I went to some other folks' homecomings and stuff. So I definitely always kind of felt missing some of those things, but I would do it all over again. I would go to the same school. But I think what we did, because again, there's no comparison to an HBCU experience, as a Black person at a predominantly white institution, we are, especially at UCLA at the time, about 50,000 students, maybe at that, it's better now. I think it's about 6% now, but at that point it was less than 3, maybe 2% Black. And a good majority of those folks are athletes, but with it all, like, most of us knew each other. So a lot of us came from programs like early summer school access programs, where we kind of built relationships before school started. But really, with so little of us, we had a pretty strong community, and like within our African Student Union, as what we call it. And that was our ability to kind of, every school in this UC system, like the 8 UCs, we all, kind of, that was the same makeup in all of them, like, Berkeley, Irvine, UC San Diego. UC Santa Barbara and some others, the makeup was pretty similar for all of them as far as Black students. So we have certain conferences where like all the Black students that go to the UC schools, we would meet up at like one of the schools and have like what we call our African Black Coalition Conference, pretty much a big conference of like all the Black students of the UCs, right? And that was our way of kind of just coming together and like one for advocacy, talking about like our struggles at our campuses, our collective struggles. Some schools have very specific struggles to where their location is, right? I think being in LA, we were a bit more privileged in a lot of ways because there are certain like Black communities throughout LA, right? But other folks who went to like, a UC Merced or UC Irvine, mostly white communities, mostly rich communities, right? Being Black living in those spaces. So everyone having their own specific issues, but the event will culminate with like, a big social gathering. And it's like you built these connections with people at other schools. And like, like if anyone went to college with me, Black person went to college in the UC system while I was there and they were involved, it's highly possible that I know them. That's how kind of close we tried to make ourselves, even at other universities. But like, yeah, being in Los Angeles, although USC will always be the enemy in like in sports and everything. There are some great people I met there, especially being in the fraternity. But we did our best as far as like using LA as a space for us to all congregate and try. A lot of driving and traveling. You make the most of the experience and you find that community. And that's the thing about the experience at a predominantly white institution is that you kind of have to do a bit more. You have to do more work to find your community. But sometimes that kind of makes it mean that much more because you did the work to find them. You built these connections and you found like your niche. Mm-hmm. But it is tough, especially when like, for me going on and the only place that like, was majority Black and all of my education was my time at Columbia, my master's, which is like probably the best time I've had in academia because I was getting my degree in African American studies. It was a space that was built on African American studies, built on Black people, Black livelihood, Black culture. So, it was a lot less of me explaining a lot of things. But what it did was teach me how to be grounded in myself, my culture, but also like how to be able to communicate that to spaces outside of my own. So like these experiences definitely helped me out in that way. I'm able to navigate these spaces because I had to, right? I had to learn to do it in the most usually difficult ways because I would have faculty who didn't understand what I was trying to do because simply didn't have that cultural understanding. So it took, a lot of work on my own part to make that relevant.
Yes, definitely. You have to find your footing when you're Black at a PWI because not everybody is culturally competent enough to know the dynamics within the African American culture, and you have to deal with the microaggressions, whether it be somebody making snide remarks, wanting to give you the brother handshake instead of a regular shake, or asking you, so what do you think, when you're the only Black in a class where there's not a lot of you. But at HBCU, you have the ability to be able to have all of your Blackness be fully embraced, not be unapologetic, and walk in your Blackness and be celebrated for being Black and the richness of your history.
Yeah, I mean, that's the tough part. That's the when it comes to the struggle of finding your community, because at the predominantly white school, it's I'll go to class, and I always was the only Black person in my class because like I said, I was like a gender women's studies major, so I was only male and the only Black person too. So having those two things, but for me, like I got an education that I would never would have gotten otherwise, so I don't regret it at all. But there were times where it was difficult, and like I made use of office hours where there were like, but some professors still didn't get it, of course. But a lot of times the in-class work would be the difficult work to do, or like the kind of isolated or feeling alone. So it was that out of class time, spending time with the community, friends, and other groups that really was my safe space, my safe haven. And I think that we did our best because pretty much every student, and I mean, there's so few of us amidst so many students were the only Black person in their course, right? So we all kind of were able to build community throughout that and like share information and like build study groups based off of like our larger Black Student Union meetings and events. So yeah, those communities became necessary. And also we found places in which we can fully be ourselves. And also came to a point that we realized that we had to use the knowledge, like, we're at UCLA, so we're all, capable students and scholars. We had to realize that we can, even though these spaces may not be built for us, or to even include us, we are competent enough to make it do that. And we're competent enough to like use the work in these courses that we learn to reflect it back to our own communities and be able to, in a coherent way, like speak to our class about like how whatever subject we'll be discussing that day affects our community specifically. So that's another thing too, just encouraging folks to, yeah, the professor may not bring certain things up or the class might not focus on that, but find your ways to kind of gauge what you're learning in class and reflect it back to how it's working with you personally and your own community. And that was been a way to like, if you can like competently, express that in classes, I think that's a great way to kind of, feel included in these spaces that just simply aren't built for you.
Right, because when you kind of look at the college experience, and with everybody kind of finding comfort and familiarity with the racial groups, it kind of feels like in real life higher learning. To me, one of John Singleton's very most important films, along with Boys in the Hood and Poetic Justice, how you're not trying to separate yourself based on race, but you find comfort in that. But you just got to know at the same time, you can't be fully immersed when others try to come in and say, oh, it's a Black thing. We find safety in that, but you got to be able to allow yourself to understand that, okay, I can be in this world, but also I got to step here. And even though you feel like it's not your responsibility to have others understand what goes on in our culture, you do have to somewhat let them know and understand so that way they could be more culturally competent.
Yeah, absolutely. And because that's what the world is, right? Unless you're going to possibly be in an enclave of just Blackness your whole life, which is, I don't see that really happening in America, but it will really rarely happen. But I realized that I was kind of forced to realize that with like, the school I went to and the degree choice I made and even the career choice I made, right? There are going to be spaces where you have to figure out how to live amongst, talk with, and like, work with folks who necessarily aren't a part of the community, may not understand it. But yeah, it's about the work you do, being able to establish its importance and making its importance clear through the years of work you do. You're going to feel that work is a part of you. You can't really like, it's a part of who you are. So everything I do now is Blackness is always in the forefront. It's always about Black popular culture, Black people, and it's always about educating on us navigating and infiltrating these spaces. And I've basically, white colleagues or other colleagues who or administrative individuals who don't understand that, don't see a point in it, see it's necessary, but to a point that like it's very easy to want to stifle that and not talk about it anymore for the sake of like just really even getting employed. But really, you think of the long term, you're doing yourself a disservice by not talking about those things. And I think that, yeah, it's not about approaching it in a way that's like, you can't enter here, it's just a Black space. It's about, making yourself, or like teaching yourself and going through the trials of being, able to educate for those who wouldn't even understand this cultural specificity, but also making it clear to them the importance of it in this building of what America is, like America's history is Black history. And really this idea that opening yourself up to like, the world won't, especially in America, won't be just this way, just you and your community at all times. You need to understand that like, it's about us. We can all have our differences and, at least strive to kind of work in cohesion, but still like everything I'm gonna do is always going to be Black first. However, I can also, teach about histories of oppression, media, all the things with two white students, two white colleagues, because I'm approaching in a way that reflects all of our history, right? Now it reflects how everyone has, how this nation has come to develop. And I think that, folks are starting to get that now. I mean, there's always going to be some folks that won't get it or don't see the need to, or think that this cultural racial specificity is a deterrent from making things equal. But it's really about just standing firm in what you do, and knowing that there will always be a need for wanting to have a comfort and safety within your own community, of course, and you always got to have those. But the reality is finding a way to, often it's kind of like coexisting with the people who may not share that community, but you share the same spaces with them professionally.
Mhm. You have to wear that dual mask and pretty much learn
Mm.
how to code switch at an early age. And go back and look at Blackish, because Blackish was doing its job at pretty much bringing home the points that Blacks have to deal with in workspace, life space, where it's not a lot of you and you just have to feel like you're walking that ever so tight rope.
Yeah, and it comes to the point that and I realized I never thought I really could switch, but I realized that like there are moments that kind of unconsciously there are things that like obviously I would say here but wouldn't say there. But then it comes to a point that sometimes you realize code switching can be, and I think it depends on the field too. For myself in academia, code switching can become a deterrent because it at times has made folks kind of assume what your answer would be or assume your perspective on something. But I realize above all, if you know your stuff, if you publish, if you read enough, if you know like the field and how and folks can't really argue your depth of knowledge on this, that's one of the strongest tools against these ideas of like trying to live within these coded spaces. The fact that like no one else can do what you do, and you make that clear through your work you're doing, through the word, through like the things you quote in books, through your research work, you make that clear that yeah, there may be an established kind of like code here based off of a space that wasn't built for you. But if you make it clear to them that like, this is you occupy a specific perspective that they can't get elsewhere, that's even stronger than having to switch on the code. And I think that, yeah, there are ways to navigate that, obviously, depending on the field.
Right. And I want to touch on the point that you brought earlier about the whole shows with Tandem, Norman Lear, and how it was Black actors, actresses, but it was white creators, white writers, not a lot of us in the room. And then we progress to
Right.
the 80s. We see the likes of Keenan Ivory Wayans, Robert Townsend. We saw what Eddie Murphy did with Saturday Night Live and its box office superstar. And then the renaissance of the 90s with Def Comedy
Right.
Jam, Martin, New York Undercover, the guy from Philadelphia who we all know, but I'm not going to say his name. We know who he is. And, what he did with his show, A Different World, and how we progress from, like you mentioned, you having to almost have that gatekeeper let you in. But by the time the 80s and the 90s hit, and of course now with Donald Glover in Atlanta, Issa Rae wrapping up Insecure, Jordan Peele with his bevy of movies, and how Black spaces are being put to the forefront was like, hey, we don't need your approval. We can just put it out ourselves. And I also should mention the work that John Singleton, Spike Lee, and the Hughes brothers did as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing is, so too, it's like in a case like where I think it got to a point in the 90s mainly where they realized, which is why you have the 90s has that largest influx of Black TV like ever. Actually, you mentioned the Arsenio Hall episode on Dark Side of the 90s on Vice. I actually was in two more episodes this season. One was on the show Cops, and one just released last week on it's about 90s sitcoms in general. And we were talking in that one about the fact that 90s is when television producers, advertisers, marketers, they realize how much Blackness sells, right? So it got to the point that to this day, majority of these producers and executives in these companies are still white, but they deal with Black content because they know how profitable Blackness is as a culture, fashion, music, art, everything. So when it comes to folks you mentioned, yeah, obviously the amount of control that some Black artists have in their productions is much better, right? It's kind of like not even comparable to times in the 70s and such. But often that control is still at the behest of a kind of larger white executive producer that has to give that access, and gatekeeping looks differently. It's more coded now, I would say, but also it's like that access is given on like, you know, premium network TV like a FX or like a HBO with like Issa Rae, right? Or certain spaces allow that in a way that like network TV, like the, you know, CBS, NBC, Fox, ABC, those are still kind of like the traditional structures of what television was built off of. So those ones are still a bit more at times like old school as far as like, you know, how they represent race, which is why like you have kind of that one show that's like the Black show every now and then, you know, like, you know, for a while it was Blackish, and now it's going to be Abbott Elementary, you know. So like there are times where, and the fact that, you know, we name these great Black artists, but we can like name all of them, right? Versus we can't name all the white artists because like there's just all of them are, right? So, and I think that there kind of is always going to be clear that there's a deficit in the amount of Black artists, but obviously we are moving in great ways. We are, and I think streaming has opened up that door a lot as well too, as like a new era of what media looks like. But largely who these Black artists are, we know all their names, which is a great thing. We herald them, but you know, it's still the point that, you know, there's such a plethora of white producers and white media makers, that of course the few Black ones we know and herald, but you know, wouldn't it be a point that, you know, the marketing of the show isn't because it's a Black artist, but because it's a good show, right? And but yeah, above all, I think that in looking at the 70s, right, I start there because I think it's such a pivotal moment that got us where we are here. Because, you know, before that, in like 50s and 60s, you know, the idea of using TV as a space of social relevance to kind of move forward social justice issues, civil rights, et cetera, wasn't really seen as such. So the 70s being the space of like using comedy to do it as well was very important, because it's kind of put this idea of what America thought to be funny, but also through like these subtle kind of jabs at the establishment, government, politics, in a way that can only be palatable with comedy to be that could soften the blow a bit. So the 70s was that space that did that. And, you know, with the white producer, especially like, you know, normally in Bud Yorkin through All in the Family, that show was the first show to kind of like do that in such an explicit way, but from a white perspective of a white family. But that show, the cachet and like the star power of that show really gave them the gamut to kind of do whatever they wanted. And then realizing that, okay, Black people are asking for a voice on TV to see themselves. That's what gave them the energy to be able to do all these other different shows. But yeah, the Black artists and actors and actresses of the shows, we know them, you know, and we herald them, but largely the producers of these shows, the ones who were given like the credit as the authors of these shows. So a lot of my work is about giving voice to these folks who, to the mainstream, and
Right.
not to just Black. Mhm.
Right. And it's also crazy that you mentioned that at the same time that these shows were up and running and everybody was running home, getting in front of that big box TV. This is before
Yeah.
HD and plasma TVs, kids, and the streaming
Mhm.
stick. You actually literally had to sit
Yeah.
down, watch it, get the TV guide, and if you missed it, you missed it. But at the same time, shows such as Ellis Hayslip's Soul. If you have not seen the
Yep.
Mr. Soul documentary, check that out, and also check out my interview with Melissa Hayslip, and also Soul
Mhm.
Train, and how in the cultural aspect, although they weren't sitcoms, they were music and cultural expressions of us. And both of those shows pretty much had a legacy that's still being talked about to this day. And I felt Soul definitely was ahead of its time and paved the way
Absolutely.
for a lot of the cultural competent shows that we see today with, you know, Black was talking about our issues, our voices, and just being bold in your Blackness. And of course, we all know Soul Train as an institution and a mainstay, and everybody has been influenced by the hippest trip in America.
Absolutely. And I think those shows you mentioned, those were about 68 to about, so like those were like even leading up to these sitcoms of the 70s, right? This idea of like these public access television being the space of like for Black expression. So yeah, Soul being one huge one, Black Journal being another one, or the ones where they're Say Brothers. It's a
Mm,
was one based in Boston.
mm.
And another one called
Was it Tell It Like It
uh,
Is or something like that?
Felt Like It Is, Inside Bedford Stuyvesant, like being like about living in Bedside, Brooklyn. It's like a local show about Black culture and community in Bedside, Brooklyn, right? So all these smaller shows, these niche shows about Black life preceded these sitcoms, but what it made, what it realized, folks realized, okay, there is a space for people to Black people do are invested in seeing themselves, and here we can see on the small scale, like let's make it big and national scale, right? There's a show called, excuse me, there's a book called Black Power TV by Devorah Heitner that focuses on these public access TV shows that really made way for Blackness being seen in like the real life Blackness through the arts, through local government, and through public access TV that led way to how we saw Blackness on in primetime television.
Right. And then with those shows and the sitcoms, we can't mention all that without talking about the importance of a little network that was started in 1980 out in Washington, D.C. by Robert Johnson. Originally, it was sharing
Mm-hmm.
time with the USA Network. Then a couple of years
Yep.
later, they ended up becoming 24 hours, and they brought you such classic shows such as Bobby Jones Gospel, Video LP,
Mm-hmm.
Video Soul, Comic View, Midnight Love, Rap City, Video Vibrations, what I grew up on. So let's talk about the importance of BET, and then also at the same time what Kathy Hughes was doing with what was known at the time as Radio One, now Urban One, and how she took a lot of these small radio networks in and around DC, made them powerhouses. WHUR, home of the Quiet Storm, rest in peace, Mr. Melvin Lindsay. Then also Petey Green and his impact, and how Petey Green's Washington, it was one of the first early shows that aired on BET during its infancy. And if you have not seen Talk to Me by Don Cheadle, with Don Cheadle playing Petey Green, do yourself a favor and listen.
Yep. Yep, absolutely. I mean, the legacy of BET, it's hard to even like sometimes put into words. I know it has taken many many shapes, many forms since its like inception, but no one could like deny its particular impact on the Black community, and largely how it, you know, the story of how it was sold and how it was created. Really seeing a space where Black executive power was put forth to like really make a show for Black entertainment. It's like a, sometimes thinking about like it's just like amazing to hear, because a colleague of mine, Beretta Shamade, has a book called Pimpin' Ain't Easy, Selling Black Entertainment Television. This idea about where it started as this kind of public affairs, politics, like news space, and kind of it ended up kind of more going more towards music, pop culture. I mean, flowed with what's happening in culture in America, right? So like music, Black popular culture, more like lifestyle, more like reality stuff nowadays. But it really was the space of yeah, because like you mentioned, yeah, like Ebony and Jet magazine, these places where what they would literally do was there'd be a page in one of the magazines saying like what Black people will be on TV what day. Like folks were like fiending to see Black people on TV so much that they actually had to go to these magazines to know what people will be featured on a show, even if it's for like one scene. It'll say like this person is in this show airing on this day, right? And so to have an entire network for Black people, not just featuring them in like as side supporting characters or actors, but for them, a space that's created for them to talk about a larger Black community. It was everything in the moment, right? And it led the way to realizing how cable can work in America, and how cable really became this new aspect of like newer technologies and focusing on more niche audiences, to the fact that like TV was meant for, largely in its inception, about this idea of family viewing. So every show was meant to, even if the show was majority of Black audience, majority of Black cast, it was really written for everyone to be able to enjoy and consume the show, right? So with BET, its niche was particularly made for Black people to enjoy and consume the entirety of the network, not just one particular show. So with that being the impetus behind it, it changed the culture of how networks as a whole tend to or try to focus on different niches, in this case a Black niche. And yeah, like you mentioned, Radio One, just another space where, to this day, like, radio has been that kind of that space where Black folks have kind of also been so important to communicating Blackness, right? Like Kathy Hughes, I think she's second richest Black woman in the United States, and she's been, pivotal to Black communication, right? And of course, like, Tom Joyner, the Tom Joyner Morning Show, like how long that lasted as like this space of talking about Black culture, livelihood, and lifestyle. And I think now too, even shows like, The Breakfast Club, for instance, right? Definitely much more in the pop culture, music, entertainment style, but still, like, even now, they think of politics, every like more liberal leaning political official has to like go through that show as a stop in their campaigns now. So this idea of Blackness being this now certified and, I would say, if not respected, valued place that people realize that the Black votes, the Black dollar is so important to their success. BET is one of the spaces that kind of made that clear to everybody. Like, oh, a network catering to Black perspectives can be profitable. So let's take the Black eyes and the Black money seriously.
Right. And BET was a lifeline for Black artists because, as you know, at this time, MTV hardly ever played Black artists. Rick James
Yep.
raised fuss about it. Then, of course, there's an infamous interview with David Bowie being interviewed by Mark Goodman of MTV. And he was questioning MTV's practices of not playing Black videos. And, of course,
Yeah.
he had the standard line of, well, MTV is, rock, AOR, and that doesn't really fit our niche, but if you take a look at pre-Michael Jackson MTV, post-Michael Jackson MTV, that pretty much changed the game because Walter Yetnikoff, who was president of Columbia CBS Records, pretty much called MTV, told them, I'm pulling all the videos from your library if you do not play Michael Jackson. And then that led for Prince and all the other Black artists that ended up coming down the pipeline. And then VH1 hired legendary radio programmer, DJ, the chief rocker, Frankie Crocker, as one of the early DJs of VH1. And they were more open into paying Black artists, where MTV was still kind of slow to the party, but then ramped up full speed when, rest in peace, Ted Demme put together Yo MTV Raps.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, I mean, you laid it out right there. I think that, yeah, it was a space that had to, accept Blackness like through threat, really, through threat of losing, a huge backbone of what moves the market as far as like, culture, music, and media, and and like fashion and just like art, right? And yeah, Yo MTV Raps like was a huge space for like that, like wasn't anything like it before. Fab Five Freddy brought folks out to kind of really bring rap to the mainstream, because it still was, considered like a low art. So it wasn't considered like a reputable type of music and what MTV was trying to establish. But we can go back and we know who we created rock music in the first place, right? So and then that got whitewashed and we got written out of that history often. So it's really this idea of a purely American and Black and brown art form like hip hop invading this mainstream. And MTV, at the end of the day, these networks only do what they're going to only do things for profit. I think oftentimes that's what I learned a lot of my work is that, like, yeah, shows like, networks like Fox, for instance, in the 90s, they had to have this plethora, and that seemed like someone so invested in Black popular culture because, again, all the great shows of the 90s were largely through Fox. And it's largely because Fox was trying to compete with other networks. They were the new network trying to compete with everyone else. So their niche was, let's get the young urban crowd, give them the money they want. And then once Fox's name was big enough, they abandoned Blackness, right? So really, every network on TV, you may think that they are, invested in certain things, but they're invested in what makes them profit. Because then these are still businesses. And MTV knew that you cannot ignore hip hop because it's force and how much money it's making and how it's like really dominating as this new space in popular culture. So can't ignore it. You have to join in the fact that this isn't this is an art form that is going to be consumed. And they made the smart, financial choice and invested in it. But yeah, like most of our images in our spaces have had to be infiltrated because a fight from us. And that's just like kind of a story of how American media, just like America in general, has gone over time.
Right. You literally back in the day had to fight to get rap on the radio. Radio stations would
Yeah.
segregate rap to nights where it wouldn't affect the ratings, but it really wasn't until Mr.
Yeah.
Magic Rap Attack on WBLS, originally on WHBI and other underground mix shows, college radio, that a lot of mainstream radio stations said, hey, we got to start doing what they're doing and put it on mainstream platforms. And then you had 98.7 Kiss in New York with DJ Red Alert, Chuck Chill Out, and the various different locale mix shows on urban radio stations across the country. I mean, this was back in the day where you would have singles that would say without rap at it and with rap, and liners that say and no rap. That's how strongly opposed people in management were to rap and, let's say, the New Jack Swing era, because that era was young, it was vibrant, it wasn't Motown, it incorporated rap, which wasn't for them, it was for our generation, because I consider myself a part of that generation growing up in the early mid 90s, early 2000s. That era was particularly, for me, and how it just gave R&B a shot in the arm. And then when you mentioned the shows on Fox like Martin, New York Undercover, In Living Color, Arsenio, and I think in hindsight, Fox dropped the ball with not locking Arsenio and have them be their flagship show to compete with the other late night shows like Carson, and later to come with Leno and Letterman. Because if you look at late night, even though now with streaming and other options, it's still considered the last bastion of middle America to me. White picket fence, the dog, in the American dream.
Absolutely. When it comes to media, that was one thing that started like early 50s. It's been that's one of the, they stopped, variety shows aren't really a thing anymore. But yeah, the late shows or the late night shows, that's the one thing that kind of has remained consistent since like television's inception. And it really was about this idea of how can we talk to the real America, right? That's how late night TV talked about it. And the real America was that blue collar middle America. How can we reach them? And how can this show be something that's relatively, universal to what real America is? And yeah, it is that bastion of the middle American working class folks. And still to this day, this is why every major, Tonight Show host has been, a white man, right? So this idea of this image of what America looks like has been consistent since the inception of television and the late shows.
Right. And then when you look at it in Living Color, because I know a couple years ago they were trying to do a reboot, but for other reasons it fell through. Do you think a show like In Living Color could be made today, given how we are as a society and everybody's so quick to point out cultural appropriation, and we're very culturally sensitive to race, and how back then, men on film definitely could not be made today?
Right. So I think it can be, but not on like Fox, or not like on like a network channel. It has to be like a premium cable or cable channel, like a Comedy Central, or like or some other like pay for type of network. Largely because a lot of rules and laws are different. So like when you look back at Fox when the show first came out, Fox was so new, so everything was new. So they didn't really. Everything was about making spectacle. Everything was about the shock effects, because that's going to keep people coming back. But now, yeah, a lot of the cultural sensitivities, which which should be taken seriously, a lot of them, the effect was what we see on these network television channels that are really what's like the free TV meant for everybody. ABC, CBS, NBC, and Fox. Those are the channels that are kind of meant for everyone, which is why like all the major sports games are on those channels, and all like Olympics, all these things are on those channels, because those are still the most like watched channels, because you don't need like premium cable to watch those. All you need is like a network hookup. So on channels like that, no, a show like that could not exist in the same way. I mean, of course it can exist, because you know a Saturday Night Live exists, but particularly from a Black perspective and from the comedy in the way that kind of unabashed way that they did it, then it wouldn't land the same way. And I don't think it would be as successful on those channels. But like on a premium network channel or a premium cable channel, I do think it's possible. But yeah, it's still this idea of like how things are palatable. You know, I look back at like the Dave Chappelle show, right? I think that was probably the kind of last bastion of like, you know, what a good kind of variety-esque show looks like. But you know, that's one particular person doing that, most of those skits. But I think it would need to land on a channel like that for it to
Right.
kind of be successful and do what it needs to do.
Right. I agree. And sadly, the Richard Pryor show, which had a short,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, literally short run on
10,
NBC,
10
would have
episodes.
benefited from streaming. And you can kind of see the lineage with Chappelle's show and how he was directly
Absolutely.
influenced by Pryor and Dick Gregory. And it's pretty much considered, comedy is considered the last form of truth telling. And now you feel like you can't even do that because everybody's quick to point out, you know, PC, and, you know, we're culturally aware
Yeah.
that you can't really tell the truth without stepping on some toes.
Yeah, and it has a lot of folks moving to like Netflix or other streaming services. And the large part is that, look, again, these networks specifically were meant for universal audiences. So it's about this idea of, and what's usually universal usually means, you know, I mean, there are some shows that kind of find their way around it, you know, but like if you're talking straight comedy, to the effect of like some of the predecessors we talked about, um, a lot of those rub too many people the wrong way, or rub those with the powers that be the wrong way usually. So when it comes to those appearing on these certain spaces, that's why a lot of shows like, you know, end up getting like, you know, canceled. I think like the Carmichael show was a really good show. Was really moving forward through like its the first 3 seasons. And then, you know, Gerard Carmichael just wasn't the space for him anymore and kind of moved on to doing more stand-up stuff outside of network TV. But it really comes this idea of like a power of like a control over your actual narrative, which again at this network space there's so much bureaucracy there too. Like, yeah, you can probably be the showrunner creator like Kenya Barris of Blackish, but you still don't have the final say what's on the show because you're not an executive, right?
Right.
So those power structures really impede a lot of folks from really being able to make certain discussions or comedy happen. So yeah, it's a difficult space to think about kind of what, where, and how comedy and where it's expressed now. You realize it's on the streaming services or on like the premium cable. So, which in an effect is, I was talking about is like, you know, difficult for folks because, you know, that takes, you know, you need money to afford to watch these things, you know, and all these streaming services aren't cheap, right? So the access to these shows and to this other like forms of popular culture, is not for everyone. Everyone has the ability to see these things, and that leads to again a kind of an imbalance of how media can be consumed and who's actually being able to see these things.
Yeah, all your streaming services together is just about as high as the price of cable, and your bill is just as long as a CVS receipt. But I want to do my
Absolutely.
Arsenio pose really quick, and I want to
Mm-hmm.
shift gears real quick to talk about the movement that we're seeing in college athletics. You know, tradition is getting blown up for the money. You know, UCLA and USC are going to be hopping to go to the Big Ten, get that Midwest
That's
money. Then also you're seeing the NIL and young men taking control of their financial power and saying, hey, if you want me, you got to pay me, instead of being like SMU and having boosters pay under the table. We're going to bring it up
yeah.
on the table. And then being at Texas, where of course, you know, Texas is football crazy, and how it's pretty much come on down, bring your oil money, bring your bag money, whatever money you get. I'm open to the highest
Yeah.
bidder. It's like real life blue chips out here in these streets. So what's your thoughts on NIL and athletes pretty much taking control of their power and standing up and using their voices to speak out on social injustice issues, especially after seeing what happened with Colin Kaepernick, and then previously we can mention Mahmoud Abdul Rauf, and then as
Yeah.
far back as Juan Carlos and Tommy Smith in '68.
Yeah. I love the fact that athletes are able to do this now. I love the fact that we're knowing them as voices, and we're knowing them as not just athletes. And I think that's an important thing too. I think we've been in a place so long that, you know, and I'm a huge football fan. So like, I think we've been in a place so long that everyone has kind of just considered these people like athletes, and like their livelihood hasn't been something that people consider or even think about. But I look at other folks. I look at folks like, Naomi Osaka in tennis, and like Simone Biles and like gymnastics, like young Black women, tops of their fields, speaking about their mental health and speaking about the reality of things that people were, as much as the majority of people, just viewers of them, they're pretty much like, look, just, we don't care about that. Just do your, be athletic, right? And I'm glad that we're seeing them as human now. But going on like the college aspect, these young Black men who are like, denying Division I NCAA contracts to go to HBCUs, right? Getting more. And you see like Deion Sanders, being a football coach at Jackson State, at HBCU, and encouraging students to go there. I think it's a beautiful thing to see, because a lot of the history of how the NFL was built off of, people who went to HBCUs as well too. But now that those are seen as less than when it comes to, college athletes moving on to the next phase of their careers. So this ability to speak up and against these things, I'm always sometimes I'm kind of afraid for these athletes though too. I always wonder, like a Kaepernick, unfortunately he was one who had to be kind of the martyr in a lot of ways. I'm always proud of the work he did and proud of like how he's able to speak up, but sometimes I do feel like a fear for some athletes as well coming after that, if they would be barred and blacklisted this in the same way. And it's just definitely a difficult pill to swallow, but I love the courage of those who are willing to do that. And I think that, Kaepernick as an individual, took a lot of the burden from many folks being able to even think about doing that. But again, we think of power structures, we think of the fact that there are, no like 100% like, NFL like owners. I think there's one actually, but like there's, compared to like, of all the teams, where the power lies. And like, obviously this sports, if you're talking about the NFL football specifically, can't live without, Black bodies being, and Black people being the ones to play these sports. But unfortunately, a lot of folks in these power structures feel that a certain individual will be expendable, or like, oh, wait next year to grab somebody else who doesn't have a perspective on this stuff. We'll just play, right? So I'm always kind of fearful of, talking about football specifically, my Black brothers that like really are able to express themselves, and usually it's those who are that good that they know they're going to go somewhere anyway, or they're like kind of guaranteed these spaces that not everyone may be guaranteed. So it's always sometimes a fear for me, but those who have the courage to do so, I think these universities have made the money off their backs for so long, so I think it's good that they're now getting these things. But my main thing is just for the protection, that they always have someone to help manage these contracts, manage finances, because above all, I don't want them to get taken advantage of as well too, because so many of these folks come from difficult backgrounds where not knowing how to manage money, or like they're having to, take care of their entire families while in college when they get to probably another level of their careers. So it's a difficult thing to be so young and to have so much of the world thrown at you, while still like trying to figure out who you are. So my main thing with all this stuff is making sure that a lot of these athletes don't get consumed in these things, and that they actually have support, like trustworthy support through these things. But above all, like, yeah, they deserve this work, because I'm thinking the UCLA thing, I don't like, I'm, diehard Bruin forever, watch all the games, have season tickets. I don't like that they're moving to conferences, but I get it, to the fact that, all these things to a university are businesses, and football being that sport that makes the most money. And also, if you don't have those media eyes and like those broadcasting eyes on you, like the schools in the Midwest do or in the South do, a lot of money's being lost, right? On a aspect of like camaraderie of like being with like other teams in the West Coast, there's a certain culture there that, just so different from, sports in the Midwest, that it's going to be a very interesting transition process, a couple years in a lot of ways for like recruiting, lifestyle, livelihood, and all that. But we're here now. And we're just going to see how it's going to go. But yeah, it's going to change a lot of the way in which recruiting is done, how the sport is played, and largely kind of how much of it is like for the pure joy of the sport versus just profit.
Right. And it kind of makes me wonder what's going to happen to the bowl alignments because, with the Rose Bowl, Pac
Yeah.
12, and Big Ten. And, you mentioned USC. And of course, you at Texas. Best college football game I ever seen in my life. '06 Rose Bowl, Texas versus USC. I was happy that
Oh yeah.
USC lost when Vince Young scampered into the touchdown. I
Oh, I
was
love
super
that. I
happy.
loved it.
I
Yeah.
hated that USC team, Matt Leinart, Reggie Bush, Lindell
Reggie
White,
Bush. Yeah.
Dwayne Jarrett, all y'all. I hated y'all. I hated y'all. I hated y'all. I hated y'all. But
amazing game. Yeah.
But you look back in hindsight, those USC teams are great, just like how back in the 80s and 90s, those University of Miami teams, the 90s Nebraska Cornhuskers with Tommy Frazier, Scott Frost. We could go down the list. And it's still kind of hard for me to see Maryland in the Big Ten because I grew up in Tobacco Road, ACC country, and used to seeing them in the ACC. But it always, like you said, it's all about the money and will blow up tradition for the sake of money. Now, what's your thoughts on Texas landing Arch Manning? If you don't know who Arch Manning is, look up Peyton.
Oh yeah.
Look up Eli.
Oh yeah.
Look up Archie. Look up Cooper. He comes from that lineage.
Omaha. Yep, absolutely. I mean, that's amazing for Texas. I've been here about 3 years now, so I go to some of the games. Culture here is way different. They love it here. But he had the choice to go anywhere he wanted, and I think that I want to see what they offered him. I feel like they must have sold him. They had to have sold him the world because he's not like your typical, typical recruit by any means. He has, a Hall of Fame uncle, will be Hall of Fame. Will be Hall of Fame other uncle, grandfather was in. So everything he knows the process. He more than probably anyone, right? And his family lineage can get him into any office, any space. There is no ambiguity there. So for him to choose here, there had to be the pitch had to be amazing, right? So I think it's great for Texas. I think that it's going to bring a lot of folks' attention back to this because this conference has been, Texas in general within the Big 12 has been start off the season with great rankings, but hasn't matched up to it throughout the season. So I think this will bring a lot more attention and energy back to the space. So long as they recruit folks that can manage with Arch. But yeah, I mean, I think it was a huge obvious marketing move, but they had to, for Arch to come here, they had to give him something more than that because again, he's not a regular recruit. His uncle could call up any coach in the nation and get a meeting. So it's about really what it is that he's gonna be offered, and how he's gonna fit into this mold here. And I think that he has all the tools in his holster. He has all the advantages. So it's really just about how they develop a team around him. And Texas has a brand new coach as well. I think it's probably his second or third year. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that happens. But that's not till fall of 23. That's next year, I believe. Yeah.
Right, because it's kind of crazy to see how he kind of broke the SEC tradition, even though Texas is going to be soon joining the SEC with Oklahoma, because Peyton went to Tennessee and Eli and Archie went to Ole Miss. Now he decided to come on down to the Big 12. And as we know in Texas, high school football is king. Watch Friday Night Lights, watch the 30 for 30, What Caught a Loss, and how Texas just takes the obsession with high school football to another level. Their stadiums look like NFL stadiums, and how coaches are openly recruiting kids in 6th, 7th, 8th grade to come play for their high school so that they can build dynasties. So can we talk about the juxtaposition with how some of these kids are kind of already experiencing what it's like to be a 5-star recruit, of course, with NIL now in the play, but you kind of had a little deal of that on the high school level, given how ferocious and how competitive Texas high school football is.
Well, yeah, part of it is social media as well too. Folks are able to, create their own highlight tapes, send their information to other folks, build followings that largely make them, kind of larger than life in high school already, right? To a point that wasn't able to be done in previous generations too. So you add all these things together with NIL, with like, incentives, bonuses, like off season, like, club teams, all that. When you think about like basketball and football as well too, it is a whole different culture that the fan base of these individuals begins at like age 14 for a lot of them, right? So, in the aspect of Arch Manning, he had he grew up within this dynasty, so he had all the tools of his exposure already. So like, a person that, money was never an issue for him, or like facilities or going to training camps, all those various things where other folks have to kind of fight more for those things, or fight to get a space, fight to afford them, or really find their own way to make themselves, their name popular. His name itself has a history towards it. Other folks have to make their own name, so they resort to things like social media and those spaces to publicly, like, build their profile. So I think that plus NIL plus folks like, there are folks now getting verbal commitments at age 14 or 15, right? Choosing what college they want to go to already. And I think, for me, I love the idea of student athletes, because in the day folks can make their way to college, get it paid for, and get an education. I'll always be in support of. But these things are something that I think that no one could have saw coming, largely with like the way this advent of social media has really recreated how recruiting is done, how outreach is done, and really with NIL added to that, how folks now are expecting something because their likeness is being used, their athletic ability and their athletic prowess is being used for the benefit of these big universities. So yeah, let them get the piece of the pie.
Yep, get the bag, and we have a Bruin to thank for that, Ed O'Bannon.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Mr. Ed O'Bannon. And before we wrap and give shout outs and current projects and everything, I want you to talk about briefly the impact of Houston hip hop with Rap a Lot, everything that came out of there, Chopped and School Culture, DJ Screw, then of course UGK out of Port Arthur, Texas.
Well, my experience with Houston hip hop has largely been like new. I mean, growing up, like being from California, growing up, you start to hear the influences of DJ Screw. You start to hear, the Mike Jones, the Paul Walls, the all the folks that kind of come from this longer era of Houston hip hop. So my experience with it has kind of been more new coming here, but a lot of folks coming from that space. I think one now who I really enjoy, his name Toby Nigwe from from A-Leaf, Texas, which is kind of right outside of this Houston area, like Southwest Houston. But you can kind of hear the inflections in his artistry and his work that are very much traditional to the Houston sound and the soundscape of what built Houston as this kind of powerhouse for the hip hop scene. So yeah, but I'm still myself learning that era, because I grew up in West Coast hip hop, which is like if you're from there, you're entrenched into that. So I grew up with that deeply entrenched into me. So like folks like Kendrick Lamar, for instance, and like folks who come from this tradition of Dr. Dre's making productions and influences, and NWA, those have always been the folks that were kind of drilled in me from my adolescence. But actually moving around, like moving to New York a bit, living in Philly for a year, back to California, then now here, I think I'm realizing so much more now how much the culture of a specific area, you could hear that in their music. So I think that now that I've actually been getting into more of the Houston-based or Texas-based hip hop as of now being in here.
Right, because me being from North Carolina, we dabbled and dabbled in everything because we were right in the middle, because we were hearing what was coming out of Atlanta, what was coming out of Houston, what was coming out of Memphis, what was coming out of New York, what was coming out of LA. So you pretty much had a buffet of everything. And then of course,
definitely did. Yeah.
Then of course, in the 90s, West Coast hip hop was at its peak with NWA, Dre, Death Row, what was coming out of the Bay with E40, Too Short, Mac Dre, Hammer, Farside, Souls of Mischief, Loonies, Ice-T, of course, legendary album, Rhyme Pays. And it's still shocking to me to see him on Law and Order to this day, but I knew him as Scotty Appleton from New Jack City and Danny Up
Yeah,
from New York Undercover. I'm
absolutely.
still haven't forgiven him for killing off Michael Michelle. You know, Malik Yoder was sick.
Yeah,
He was sick when
yeah,
he
yeah.
showed up in the bedroom and shout out Michael Michelle. But before we conclude, Dr. Sebro, any shout outs you want to give, current projects, plug your social media, sir.
Yeah. I mean, current projects right now. Like I mentioned, I'm working on getting this book published for right now. It's called It's called Scratch and Surviving: Hustle Economics and the Black Sitcoms with Tandem Productions. Hopefully slated around like a fall of next year, fall of 2023 release. But working to get that through the pipeline through Rutgers Press. Other than that, I'm just I was recently featured in 3 episodes on Dark Side of the 90s on Vice TV, episode 1, 3, and 7. Episode 1 is on the Arsenio Hall show. Episode 3 is on the television show Cops. And episode 7 is on Black sitcoms of the 90s. So I really enjoyed that process of working with this company and producing that through Vice, and I was able to talk some of my knowledge on TV and popular culture. So definitely catch those. Other than that, my Twitter is a Sebro PhD, Sebro PhD, and I can be reached there. Added me there. Just love talking all things Black and everything Black, and I'm just happy to be here discussing these things with you. I'm looking forward to a good fall semester here at UT. And there's just so many things now I think are just looking well moving forward. So again, thank you for having me here.
Right. And you can catch this interview wherever you stream podcasts, on YouTube at youtube.com/beyond the album cover. And be sure to keep updated with the podcast at facebook.com/beyond the album cover, because this podcast is for us, by us, for everybody as well. But it's blackety black at the core. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big thank you to Dr. Adrien Sebro, Assistant Professor, University of Texas, Hook 'em. Thank you once again for coming on, sir.
Appreciate having me. Thank you.
Yes, sir.